Hi, my name's Phil. I like talking about politics, and in this video I'd like to discuss how reports of the latest Brexit charges for businesses have started to land, and some are finding out they're being charged more than they thought they would, but are getting less in return. This could well mean that the Brexit inflation on food in the coming year could be higher than anticipated. And remember, these are charges that nobody would have had to pay had we at least remained in the single market. But first, if you'd like to be notified of daily news and politics, please subscribe to the channel. So when it comes to issues of leaving the single market in particular, the EU applied standards checks on British exports to the EU on day one. In return, we had nothing on goods coming from the EU at all for years. Earlier this year, after lots of delays, the then Conservative government started to slowly implement standards controls. Just to quickly point out why these are important, they cover things like food and livestock. Without physical checks, we have no way of knowing if what's in the back of the lorry is what the paperwork says it is. You know, when people like Jacob Rees-Mogg kept talking about advanced border systems, they meant for checking the paperwork, not the physical goods. But what if some of the livestock being imported is diseased? Or that could wipe out entire farms. What if some of the food is unfit for human consumption, as we know is happening because it was discovered during a random operation a couple of years ago? You can't tell that from the paperwork, only by physical checks. Obviously, you can't check every consignment or you'd never get any imports in, but you need to check enough to have a decent chance of catching problems and dissuading smugglers. But we didn't. We didn't even require the paperwork for quite a while, but now the paperwork is needed, but the checks are still slow. But even though the checks are still not up to where the government promised, and even that was below what's necessary, businesses are still being charged. In order to pay for these standards checks, the government implemented a common user charge. Now, these have started to apply, and some businesses are a bit surprised about how much. And the reason, according to the industry journal The Grocer, is because there's confusion about what constitutes a consignment. So there is a cap of £145 per consignment. Now, that could be an entire truckload, or it could just be part of a truckload. So some businesses who might have thought their order would attract a fee of no more than £145 are now facing bills of up to, it says, £870, according to the British Meat Processors Association. And what's also annoying for them is these charges are not even paying for what they were told it would cover. The Conservatives had said there would be checks on 15 to 30% of imports, depending on what they were. More checks on higher risk goods. But they've now scaled it down. There's basically like 2 to 3% of checks going on, which isn't going to catch very much. So importers are now paying the fees for a small fraction of the border security that was originally proposed. They're basically paying fees, and then those fees passed on to us, for the pretense of a standards control system. One wholesaler in the report said that their cost between April and June had been about £30,000, but only about 15% of their loads had been checked. It also said that some trucks have been diverted for checks, but they don't ever get them. They sort of wait around all day and then off they go. Now, actually, I will say this has been a problem for a long time with customs checks. So this is no different. Trucks were getting sent for checks, waiting around all day, then told we might as well go because there's no one actually to carry out the check. And where food is concerned, that's not just making lorry drivers less inclined to do these runs because they get paid nothing when the wheels aren't turning, or for the people waiting for those deliveries having to wait an extra day. Food spoils. They also said that sometimes it's only the documentation which is checked. So there's no point in diverting them at all because you don't need the trucks to physically check the documentation. And this again just shows how little attention the Conservatives paid to the practical implementation of Brexit. I remind you, the EU had their full customs and standards checks in place on day one. They'd spent several years preparing for the UK leaving. We had zero checks, standard or customs, when we were leaving the Single Market and Customs Union, because there had been zero preparation for it. Even years later, we still don't have them. We are wide open to smuggling. We're applying high cost to legitimate traders in terms of making them prepare expensive documentation, making the journey times for deliveries much longer, and now charging them a fee to pay for all this unnecessary Brexit red tape that they're not even getting. I mean, imagine the Brexiteers selling this back in 2016. So, right, what we're going to do is we're going to slow down the journeys for trade, meaning that we won't be able to import as much. And, you know, when it comes to food, some of it will go off much sooner. We'll weaken the checks so that dodgy merchants could be selling food which isn't fit for human consumption. The food will be more expensive because retailers will have to pay for higher transport and administration costs, which they will pass on to the consumer. Oh, and when we decide to impose some actual checks, making the process of trading even more time consuming and therefore costly, we'll charge businesses for the privilege, meaning that they have to pass on even more cost to the consumer. And it's all especially damaging to small businesses. Like I talked a long time ago before these charges came online, that it's going to particularly hit independent delis, say, and similar businesses. Like if you're a big supermarket, you are ordering your goods by the truckload. So the entire truckload will cost you like a maximum of £145. But if you're buying small consignments of goods for different things, like you have a deli, say, it's going to rack up. Like you might buy a small amount of salami, a small amount of feta cheese, a small amount of olives, and so on. And you're paying up to £145 for each of those items. This is on top of any health certificates you might need and other administrative costs. Back in 2021, we heard of the Cheshire Cheese Company. They made a big point of pointing out that they weren't able to export cheese to individual customers in the single market anymore because the trade costs, health certificates in this case, were higher than the value of the consignment. At the time, from the British point of view, what that meant was lots of small businesses in Britain lost access to a load of their customers overnight. That meant at least lower productivity. They couldn't sell as much, which means they can't make as much. Lower tax revenues, which of course meant lower wage growth and having to pay a higher rate of tax to compensate. But now, different small businesses are hit. This time, it's not the ones who need to export to the EU, it's the ones who need to import from it. If the import costs of the goods they want are too high to pass on to the customer, they simply can't sell those products. So this will put some out of business. And those who survive will either take the hit on profits, which means lower tax revenues, or they will pass the costs on to consumers, which means the cost of living crisis is still around. And higher than expected food inflation as well, because the Grocer article says the government had estimated these border checks would cost about an extra £330 million a year. I remember talking about this. That's £330 million on top of all the other Brexit costs, none of which should have been needed if we'd have just told Nigel Farage to do one, right? But the actual costs are now believed to be nearly £2 billion a year. And that extra is going to cost someone. It's either going to cost someone their business and their customers will have to do without it, or it's going to cost the consumer more in higher food prices because those costs get passed on. And nationally, it means we're going to have even less access to fresh food. Often it's the small retailers who have fresher produce than supermarkets, but it's those small retailers who are most affected by these charges. And finally, I'll leave you with a quote via the Fresh Produce Consortium in the article. It's the least efficient and most expensive border inspection process in the world. Now, I don't know if this is a little bit of hyperbole or it really is the worst border inspection process in the world, but we can certainly surmise it's definitely inefficient because trucks are often diverted for long hours before they get their checks. And sometimes they're there for long hours and don't even get checked, just told to go. They might as well have not gone there in the first place. We also know it's expensive because these costs are really mounting up. They were already high. And if you can go from an estimate of £330 million a year to £2 billion a year, it's quite clear that even the government, and remember, we might have had a change of government, but the same officials doing the same calculations. If the government cannot accurately determine what these costs are going to be, it means even in a few years' time, these costs are going to be higher than expected. So it's obviously expensive as well. Yet the Brexiteers, led by Jacob Rees-Mogg, promised us the most advanced border systems in the world. Don't worry, technology will take care of it all. Like he knows anything about technology. Technology for him, like a fountain pen, is like the height of technology. But all that can do is check paperwork. And we don't even have that. We do not even have this advanced border system to check the paperwork. But it cannot check goods. Another way in which Brexit delivered the polar opposite of what was promised. And it was always going to, and it always will. But there we are. Those are my thoughts. Let me know yours in the comments below. If you enjoyed the video, please click the like button. If you'd like to support the channel further, you can join for memberships. Thanks for watching. Until next time, I'll see you later.